The first time I saw that $40,000 fine taped to my front gate, I actually laughed. Because the property they were trying to fine me for, it's not even their land. It's mine. Fully deeded, fully documented, and passed down through my family for generations. But HOA, Karen didn't care. She marched over, clipboard in hand, talking about violations and unauthorized modifications like she ran the place. What she didn't know, not only do I own that land, but I also know the one loophole in their bylaws that turns this whole thing back on them. And let's just say, things unraveled very quickly after that. Crescent Park Estates was the kind of neighborhood where every inch of property looked exactly as advertised. Pristine lawns, geometrically perfect landscaping, and houses that spoke of conformity, not individuality. The local homeowners association, HOA, ruled with an iron fist over every detail, ensuring every resident toed the line of their exceedingly strict guidelines. In this community, even the smallest hint of personal expression was subject to scrutiny and fines. At the heart of that regime was Karen Miller, known by everyone as HOA Karen. In her early 50s and always dressed in a crisp, conservative outfit complete with a clipboard and a perpetually active smartphone, Karen prided herself on maintaining the uniform image of Crescent Park Estates. She patrolled the streets with a hawk-like intensity, ready to file a complaint at the drop of a hat, whether it was a mailbox painted a slightly off shade of blue or a decorative lawn ornament that didn't match the neighborhood's meticulously approved aesthetic. I, on the other hand, had always believed that life was too short and beautiful to be lived behind a facade of forced uniformity. My family had owned a sprawling piece of land along the very edge of Crescent Park Estates for generations. The property was more than just land. It was a legacy, a record of our family's history, and a canvas for creativity. Over the years, I'd transformed part of that land into a thriving farm stand, where I sold organic produce, homemade preserves, and seasonal specialties that celebrated local flavors and traditions. It was my pride, my small contribution to the community's diversity of expression. For years, I had received complaints about my farm stand, mostly from Karen herself. She complained about the unauthorized modifications I made to the property, insisting that my vibrant displays and non-conforming signs disrupted the neighborhood's visual harmony. Fines were issued, warnings were sent, and yet I continued because my stand wasn't just a business. It was an expression of my heritage and my belief in living authentically. Then came the day that would change everything. One crisp autumn morning, I discovered a neatly printed notice taped to my front gate, a $40,000 fine for violations on a property the HOA claimed I had altered in unauthorized ways. I could hardly believe it. I knew full well that the land in question was mine, fully deeded, fully documented, and passed down through generations. The fine was baseless, an absurd attempt by Karen to assert her control over a property she had no claim to. What made the situation even more infuriating was Karen's complete disregard for truth. She had marched over with all the pomp of an enforcer, barking about property modifications as if she were some arbiter of law. In her eyes, I was defying the HOA's very notion of perfection. But little did she know, not only did I own the land, I was also well-versed in the fine print of the HOA bylaws. There was one particular loophole that could, and would, turn this whole debacle on its head. Crescent Park Estates was, at its core, a community divided between those who embraced conformity and those who valued individual freedom. My farm stand was my rebellion, my little oasis of authenticity amid a sea of manufactured sameness. And as I clutched that ridiculous fine, I realized that Karen's attempt to suppress my enterprise had inadvertently given me the perfect opportunity to fight back, and to do so in a way that the entire community would remember. The controversy began the moment the $40,000 fine was affixed to my gate. Neighbors whispered about it in hushed tones, some expressing disbelief, while others sympathized with my struggle for creative freedom. I took a deep breath, steadied my pulse, and began collecting every shred of evidence. I retrieved copies of the property deed, historical documents that recorded my family's long ownership of the land, and correspondences with the HOA from previous years that had all underscored my right to run my farm stand as I saw fit. I also dug into the HOA bylaws with the help of a local attorney friend. What I discovered was astounding. While the rules were strict, there was one overlooked clause concerning unauthorized modifications that stated any improvement that increased property value and contributed positively to community aesthetics could not be penalized if it complied with local zoning laws. My farm stand, which had grown to include vibrant displays of organic produce and innovative signage, actually boosted the visual appeal and economic vitality of the neighborhood. That loophole was my ace in the hole. Armed with this information, I drafted a strongly worded letter to the HOA board. I outlined the legal facts, attached copies of the deed, and even detailed how my business had, over the years, brought in customers and boosted local commerce. I argued that the $40,000 fine was not only baseless but a flagrant abuse of power, a personal vendetta driven by one overzealous enforcer, Karen Miller, who was more interested in maintaining her vision of an immaculate community than in ensuring justice for property owners. The board's initial reaction was muted. Influenced by Karen's long tenure and her reputation for strict enforcement, several board members dismissed my letter as a misunderstanding. But as I circulated my detailed evidence among other residents, the backlash grew. Neighbors began sharing their own stories of arbitrary fines and overreaching rules enforced by Karen. Digital petitions demanding the rescission of my fine and a thorough investigation into the HOA's practices rapidly gathered thousands of signatures. Every piece of evidence I shared, the deed, the bylaws, security footage of past interactions, reinforced the message that my property was mine by law and that no amount of bureaucratic aggression could change that fact. In the midst of this rising tension, I decided to take my battle to the next level. The legal loophole wasn't just paper-proof. It was a beacon of hope that if the HOA board refused to act, I would have to make an example of their overreach. I publicly announced my intention to challenge the fine in court if necessary, but also made it clear that I was prepared to use the loophole to force them to pay a hefty penalty if they persisted in targeting me. The idea was simple. If they tried to enforce a fine on property that legally belonged to me, then by law, the burden of proof would fall on them, and I would have the right to countersue for damages, potentially turning the tables and making them liable for not only my legal fees, but for punitive costs that could easily exceed $40,000. Late one night, as I reviewed the final drafts of my legal strategy and prepared documentation for a potential counterclaim, I received a notification that the HOA board had scheduled an emergency meeting to address the fine. I knew this was my moment. The digital documents, my attorney's favorable analysis of the loophole, and the overwhelming public support had created a situation where the board could no longer ignore the facts. I went to the meeting determined, evidence in hand and fire in my eyes. As the board convened, I calmly presented my case, laying out every piece of evidence with precision. I explained how the property was fully deeded to me, detailed the historical records, and, most importantly, highlighted the legal clause in the bylaws that invalidated their fines if the modification enhanced property value. My arguments were clear and resolute, and with every word, the room grew quieter, the board members exchanging uneasy glances as they realized that the storm they had unleashed was now turning on them. The tension in that meeting was palpable. I could feel the weight of every resident's support pressing in behind me, and I knew that I had effectively forced the board into a corner. The decision now rested on whether they would stand by Karen's petty claims or heed the overwhelming evidence of justice. Every minute felt like an eternity as I awaited their response, the fate of my property, and the future of creative expression in Crescent Park Estates, hanging in the balance. In the days that followed the emergency board meeting, the controversy exploded across the community of Crescent Park Estates. Social media networks came alive with posts supporting my battle against Karen's arbitrary fine. Hashtags like #MyLandAreRight, #NoMoreKaren, and #LoopholeVictory trended as neighbors who had long suffered under the oppressive weight of the HOA voiced their frustrations. Videos of my property, juxtaposed with images of the $40,000 fine taped to my gate, became viral sensations that highlighted the absurdity of enforcing a fine on land I legally owned. Local news stations, never ones to shy away from a story of David versus Goliath, descended upon Crescent Park Estates. Reporters captured the scene of my well-tended farm stand. Vivid images of organic produce, smiling customers, and vibrant community interactions contrasted sharply against the cold, bureaucratic tone of the HOA's announcements. It's a classic case of power turning on its master, one anchor observed on live television, referring to my legal challenge that had become a rallying point for those who believed in property rights and creative freedom. Within the HOA board, internal divisions became public knowledge. Leaked minutes from subsequent board meetings revealed that some members had privately acknowledged the validity of my claims. "We're at crossroads," one board member was quoted as saying. "Either we stand by these archaic policies, or we risk alienating the very residents we're supposed to serve." Yet, others remained fiercely loyal to the outdated rules, unwilling to cede any ground to someone who dared defy their authority. As the digital dossier I had assembled continued to circulate, supporters from across the community began organizing town hall meetings and public forums. At these gatherings, residents recounted similar experiences of arbitrary fines and oppressive rule enforcement. There were stories of families fined for having too many garden gnomes and of single homeowners chastised for displaying colorful art on their porches. Every account fueled the growing sentiment that the HOA's power had become unchecked and was now being wielded to stifle personal freedom and creativity. I maintained a steady online presence throughout this period, posting regular updates on my blog and social media channels. I shared screenshots of my property deed, legal analyses of the critical loophole in the bylaws, and video testimonials from supportive neighbors. One post quickly went viral with a caption, "When the law is on your side, even a $40,000 fine becomes nothing more than a bad joke." The digital community rallied behind me, and within days, an online petition demanding that the HOA board rescind the fine and reform its policies amassed tens of thousands of signatures. Meanwhile, Karen Miller's public statements grew more desperate. In a series of hastily recorded videos, she tried to downplay the incident, claiming that the fine was a standard penalty for unauthorized modifications. However, every attempt to justify her actions was met with a tidal wave of counter-evidence. Videos of the detailed property records, expert legal opinions, and even footage of past instances where other residents have been unfairly targeted by Karen emerged. The more she tried to spin her narrative, the more her credibility crumbled before the eyes of an increasingly vocal community. Local law enforcement also weighed in. In an official statement, the regional police department reaffirmed that property rights are sacrosanct and that any attempt to levy fines without a legal basis would be scrutinized under state law. When clear evidence contradicts arbitrary enforcement, the law must prevail, the statement read. This endorsement from public officials lent further legitimacy to our cause and put additional pressure on the HOA board. As the final public hearing approached, the atmosphere in Crescent Park Estates was charged with anticipation. Every resident seemed to be waiting with bated breath for the board's final decision. Neighbors organized themselves into groups, discussing strategies and sharing stories of past grievances, all united by the belief that it was time for a major overhaul of the HOA's policies. On the eve of the hearing, I took one last look at the $40,000 fine, still taped to my front gate, and felt a surge of defiance. That fine, which was meant to be a symbol of the HOA's authority, had inadvertently become the catalyst for a complete revolution in our community's mindset. It was no longer just my battle. It was a fight for every resident's right to live and thrive without arbitrary interference. The decisive moment finally arrived on a crisp morning at the Crescent Park Estates Community Center, where the final public hearing was in full session. The boardroom was packed with a diverse mix of HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and a sea of impassioned residents, each one there to witness what could be a turning point for our entire neighborhood. With a measured and resolute presence, Councilwoman Andrea Collins stepped up to the podium. her eyes reflecting the collective determination of a community that had endured years of arbitrary fines and suppression of creativity. After an exhaustive review of all digital evidence, including time-stamped photos of my property deed, comprehensive legal analyses of our HOA's bylaws, and the impassioned testimonies of countless residents, we have reached an undeniable conclusion. Councilwoman Collins began, her voice steady and imbued with authority. It is abundantly clear that the $40,000 fine issued by Mrs. Karen Miller was not founded on any legitimate legal basis. The property in question is fully deeded, fully documented, and has been in my family for generations. The fine was nothing more than a misguided exercise in control, driven by personal bias and an abuse of power. A hush fell over the room as Collins continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all fines and sanctions related to this incident. Furthermore, we will launch a full disciplinary review of the practices that allowed such an arbitrary and punitive measure to be imposed on a law-abiding homeowner. Today's vote is not simply about reversing a fine. It is a resounding declaration that in Crescent Park Estates, the rights of individual property owners will be protected, and personal vendettas will have no place in our community governance. Her words resonated powerfully, and a chorus of murmurs of agreement spread throughout the room. At that moment, a respected community advocate, renowned for his tireless work defending property rights, rose to speak. "Today, we stand united," he declared, his voice clear and impassioned. "No homeowner should have to live in fear of arbitrary fines or bureaucratic overreach. Let this vote be the turning point, a clear signal that our community values truth, integrity, and the freedom to express ourselves. We demand accountability, and we will not rest until every infringement on our rights is met with swift and decisive action." His words were met with thunderous applause, a resounding affirmation of the community's collective desire for justice. Following his address, a senior officer from the local regulatory agency presented a detailed dossier, a meticulously compiled record of every piece of digital evidence, legal documentation, and expert testimony that confirmed my rightful ownership of the property. The evidence was irrefutable. The $40,000 fine was nothing more than an abuse of power, and every claim made by HOA Karen was debunked by the facts. The Internal Affairs Panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures against those responsible for the unjust fine, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release to ensure transparency. Councilwoman Collins concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Crescent Park Estates, a community where each homeowner's rights are honored and where the arbitrary exercise of power is no longer tolerated." Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we stand for justice, accountability, and the inalienable right to manage our own property without interference. Together, we shall protect our freedoms and build a future based on fairness and respect. Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our struggle for property rights and individual freedom. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with hope and resolve, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of our community forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever alter the governance of Crescent Park Estates. The era of arbitrary fines and personal vendettas had come to an end, and a future built on respect for individual rights was finally within our grasp. In the weeks that followed the historic vote, Crescent Park Estates underwent a profound transformation. News of the rescinded $40,000 fine and the sweeping reforms instituted by the HOA board spread rapidly through local media and social networks, sparking fervent debates about property rights, community governance, and individual freedom. Editorials in the local newspaper, with headlines such as "A New Dawn for Crescent Park Estates" and "Community United for Freedom and Fairness," hailed the decisive action taken to protect every homeowner's right to live and innovate without fear of arbitrary penalties. Hashtags like hashtag property rights, hashtag no more HOA bullying, and hashtag our land, our rules trended widely, reinforcing the community's determination to stand against misuse of power. Town hall meetings and community forums saw record attendance as residents gathered to share their own stories of similar grievances. Neighbors who had long been intimidated by the HOA's draconian regulations now spoke proudly about their right to manage their property as they saw fit. "Our land has been in our family for generations," one resident declared passionately at a crowded meeting, "and we will no longer allow anyone to rewrite its history with arbitrary fines." The atmosphere was one of hope and renewal, a promise that Crescent Park Estates would always protect creativity and independence. Within the reformed HOA board and local oversight agencies, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, launched comprehensive training programs on ethical conduct, cultural sensitivity, and responsible community management. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established to ensure that every complaint was reviewed with fairness and that no resident would again be subjected to baseless fines. "Our duty is to uphold the rights and dignity of every member of our community," Lieutenant Reed stated at a follow-up press conference, emphasizing our collective commitment to justice. Community leaders and civil rights organizations mobilized further by organizing workshops, forums, and public educational campaigns that underscore the importance of property rights and individual expression. When we stand united, our voices have the power to challenge outdated regulations and demand a better future, a local activist proclaimed at a town hall meeting, inspiring neighbors to join the movement for reform. For me, the journey from receiving that absurd $40,000 fine to witnessing the transformative changes in our community was both deeply personal and profoundly empowering. My decision to stand up against HOA Karen's misuse of power, armed not just with legal documents, but with a deep belief in the sanctity of family legacy and personal freedom, had ignited a movement that resonated throughout Crescent Park Estates. The digital evidence that once symbolized bureaucratic oppression had become a rallying cry for every homeowner who valued honesty, creativity, and independence. Karen Miller, once the feared enforcer of arbitrary fines, was now relegated to a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that no one, regardless of their self-proclaimed authority, is above accountability when a community unites for justice. Digital records of her past transgressions circulated widely, and with every new sunrise, the residents of Crescent Park Estates celebrated the victory of their rights over oppressive regulations. At a final celebratory event held in the community park, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered under the gentle glow of the setting sun. A large banner reading, "Unity, Freedom, and Our Land," was unfurled between towering oaks, and heartfelt speeches resonated with promises of a future where private property was cherished and personal expression honored. Today, we celebrate not just the rescinding of an outrageous fine, but the triumph of our voices over tyranny, Councilwoman Collins proclaimed, her voice echoing with determination. The resounding applause that followed was a powerful affirmation of our collective commitment to safeguard our freedoms. As each new day dawned over Crescent Park Estates, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how HOA Karen's $40,000 fine, issued on a property that was unequivocally mine, was overturned by the power of truth and legal ingenuity, became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the right to live and work without arbitrary interference. Every sunrise now carried the promise that in Crescent Park Estates, justice, creativity, and individual freedom would forever reign. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to protect our rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it bore the promise that Crescent Park Estates would forever stand as a testament to freedom, integrity, and the unyielding power of property rights.